The silence of that town had a first and last name, a silence that didn't come from the absence of sound, but from the weight of a history buried beneath the dust of old plantations, behind the towering walls of colonial mansions, and in the suspicious eyes of the elderly. There, nestled among the mountains and valleys where time seemed to drag its feet, two names were spoken with reverence, fear, or repressed anger: Montenegro and Vasconcelos. Families as ancient as the first stone churches, still standing against decades of storms and decay. Two houses that together had built and torn apart a region's legacy. Their rivalry was more famous than any local legend or miracle-working saint. They say it all started with a river, or with a love affair, or maybe with a coffee field. The truth was lost in stories that contradicted each other, like the sharp tongues of old church ladies whispering during Sunday Mass. Some swore it was the patriarch of the Montenegros who first betrayed the Vasconcelos over a land sale, stealing a mineral-rich plot that was meant to be shared. Others, whispering lower still, claimed the eldest daughter of the Vasconcelos had been seduced and abandoned by a Montenegro, a scandal that ended in a death never explained. What's certain is this: blood was spilled. And ever since, no generation passed without a spark being lit, without an emotional wildfire raging between those families. Hatred became inheritance, passed down from father to son like a cursed will. The Montenegros were seen as proud, stoic landowners, cattle breeders, and fierce defenders of tradition. They boasted of their conservative Portuguese roots, always wearing black during important ceremonies, as if in eternal mourning for something that time would never give back. They lived on the old Negro farm, fenced high and surrounded by tales no one dared to retell. Their Sunday lunches were silent, their decisions merciless, and their family motto, honor above life, was more than a phrase. It was a verdict. The Vasconcelos, on the other hand, cultivated a more modern, cosmopolitan image, though equally authoritarian. They grew wealthy through commerce and local political deals, amassing a fortune that bought either respect or fear. They lived in a mansion in the heart of town, from which they seemed to judge everything and everyone. Their leaders often carried guns, even when unnecessary, and for every Montenegro who rose, a Vasconcelos moved like a shadow across a hidden chessboard, determined to maintain the fragile balance of an unending war. Their motto? Never forget, never forgive. Stories piled up like dust on forbidden books. There was the tragedy on the bridge, where a Montenegro was pushed by unknown hands. The suspicious fire that destroyed the Vasconcelos' most promising harvest in 1979. The duel between cousins that ended in a coma and a prison sentence. A mass interrupted by screams. A wedding turned into a funeral. Details were whispered between shots of cachaça and candles lit to protect the innocent from a curse that refused to die. And through it all, the children of both families were raised to believe their enemies were just across the street, with a different name, a different walk, a different blood. And trusting them was like signing your own death sentence. But what no one knew, not even the oldest, grumpiest advisors of either clan, was that fate, that silent traitor, was already weaving its revenge. In a world where love was always seen as weakness, it would choose passion as its weapon, and it would rise from the ashes of pride and resentment, a slow fire, but an unstoppable one. The last generation of Montenegro and Vasconcelos was about to write a new chapter in this cursed legacy, one that would not begin with "once upon a time," but with a contract signed under pressure, a wedding altar of convenience, and two hearts taught to hate each other long before they ever touched. The entire town was in shock. No one believed it when the news spread like dry gunpowder under the summer sun. The Montenegros and the Vasconcelos had signed a peace agreement. But it wasn't just any treaty. It wasn't stamped paper from City Hall or handshakes in a public square. It was a blood pact, and the price was far too high. To end the rivalry that had devoured generations, the families decided to bind their heirs in an arranged marriage. A gesture that might have seemed noble to the unknowing, but that hid rotten intentions beneath a thin layer of forced diplomacy. It was as if love had been kidnapped, gagged, and forced to bear the name of its executioners. The decision didn't come from some sudden moral awakening or the weight of remorse. No, it was born of urgent needs, political interests, and financial pressures that threatened the very foundations of both houses. On one side, the Montenegros were facing relentless decay. The land no longer yielded as before. Debts piled up, and workers began to flee the crumbling rural empire. The once proud Negro farm now reeked of abandonment. The patriarch, Domingos Montenegro, a man of harsh words and calloused hands, refused to sell off parts of the estate. He would rather die with honor than see his ancestors disgraced. On the other side, Gustavo Vasconcelos, a cold and calculating businessman, saw in the enemy's lands a golden opportunity, not only to expand his economic influence, but also to solidify a political empire he'd been quietly building for years. With allies in the upper ranks of regional government, he knew that the union of surnames would place his family in a privileged position to claim a seat in the Legislative Assembly. And more than that, it would be a subtle, yet devastating humiliation, forcing the Montenegros to depend on the Vasconcelos. It was then, amid secret meetings and glasses of whiskey spilled over property maps, that the deal was struck. Beatriz Montenegro and Leonel Vasconcelos would marry in a public ceremony, officially uniting the two houses. The contract stipulated that part of the Montenegro's land would be managed indefinitely by the Vasconcelos business. In return, rural debts would be cleared, and a generous dowry would be given to the bride's family. There was no trace of love, passion, or freedom of choice. It was all cold, precise, calculated. A transaction. Beatrice learned of the decision through the housekeeper. Her father hadn't even found the courage to tell her himself. When she saw Leonel Vasconcelos' name on the paper, her stomach turned. She knew him from a distance. Arrogant, smug, with a superiority complex he flaunted at every social event. The kind of man who spoke softly but looked down on everyone, who shook hands with disdain, and who would never, under any circumstance, see a Montenegro as a woman, only as an enemy. Leonel, for his part, received the news with a mixture of disdain and resignation. He didn't want to marry, especially not someone from the rival family. But, as always, he obeyed his father. The image of Gustavo Vasconcelos loomed over his life like a shadow, controlling, demanding, and nearly impossible to please. Refusing the marriage would be seen as weakness, and weakness, in the Vasconcelos house, was a capital sin. The official announcement came on a stifling night, during a dinner that brought both families together in the old parish house. The atmosphere was heavy, filled with fake smiles, nervous toasts, and glances sharp as knives. Beatrice and Leonel were presented as a couple about to begin a new era of peace. But anyone paying attention could see the unbearable tension between them. She avoided his touch. He spoke to her like a man serving time, and when their eyes met, there was no spark of affection, only sparks ready to ignite everything around them. Despite the public performance, rumors spread quickly. Some said the wedding would never happen. Others placed bets on how long it would last before a new tragedy shattered the fragile truce. There were those who dreamed of reconciliation, and those who prepared weapons for the inevitable return of war. But deep in the hearts of the protagonists, something even more dangerous had begun to take shape. It wasn't love, not yet. It was curiosity, contempt, disgust, and fascination. The kind of feeling that slowly corrodes certainties and turns enemies into something even they couldn't name. Deep down, neither of them knew it yet, but they were about to step into a game where the board was the heart itself, and the rules no one had ever dared to explain. The ceremony was scheduled, the invitations sent. The musicians, hired, and fate, as always, waited quietly at the bend in the road. Leonel Vasconcelos was born under the weight of a name that did not allow failure. From an early age, everything in his life had been carefully designed to preserve the legacy of superiority. He was the firstborn of Gustavo Vasconcelos, direct heir to a lineage known for never forgiving, never retreating, and never bowing. He grew up hearing tales of his grandfather's cunning, a man who manipulated elections with handshakes and veiled threats, and about his great-grandfather's coldness, who, according to whispers, had entire plantations burned to the ground out of revenge. At the dinner table, silence was law, and the only acceptable words were orders, numbers, and strategies. Affection? No. Leonel learned to love the way one learns an equation, with distance, calculation, and ice in the veins. Educated in the finest boarding schools, he spent more time within stone walls and legal textbooks than in fields or parties. The friends he had were convenient, chosen for financial compatibility or family influence. He never cried in front of anyone, never apologized. And when he made mistakes, he learned to twist them into advantage, just as his father taught him. A Vasconcelos never stumbles. He steps back to gain momentum. That phrase was etched into his mind like a branding iron, and it was by following that philosophy that Leonel became who he was. A rigid, calculating man, with a dark magnetism that blended charm with threat. He wasn't handsome in a traditional sense. He was imposing, unsettling, impossible to ignore. By 28, he already managed much of the family's businesses. He owned a logistics company, held meetings with mayors and state deputies, and was a frequent guest at social events where he felt bored but played the game well. He always wore dark suits, even when the heat was unbearable. His voice was deep, his diction perfect, and every word came out as if priced on the stock market. Women admired him, men feared him, and children fell silent in his presence. Not because he was cruel, but because his presence suggested that he could be, if he chose to. Yet behind the impeccable facade, Leonel carried an emptiness even he could not name. He didn't know what love was. He didn't believe in forgiveness. He laughed, with disdain, at anything resembling romance. It seemed tacky, pointless, weak. Everything he understood about emotions came from behavior manuals or strategic observation. You conquer what you want, then decide whether to keep it or discard it. That was the thought that crossed his mind when he received the news of his arranged marriage to Beatriz Montenegro. His first instinct was disgust. The idea of sharing his life with someone from that family made his stomach churn. He remembered the looks the Montenegros gave at balls, the bitter words, the veiled power duels. But his father summoned him to the study, the same room where deals were struck, contracts signed, and reputations ruined. Gustavo was blunt. "You will marry her, because we need this, and because it will be your greatest victory." Leonel had no choice. Pride rose louder than disgust. To marry a Montenegro and make her bear his name would, for many, be the ultimate humiliation inflicted on the rival house. He agreed, not out of desire, not out of compromise, but out of domination. He had seen Beatrice once, years ago, just a teenager with defiant eyes. The kind of girl who dressed lightly, but carried a storm in her spirit. Now, seeing her again as his bride-to-be, he noticed she was the same, only sharper, stronger, harder to bend, and that irritated him, because it made him curious. Because deep down, there was something about her that slipped from his grasp, and Leonel hated everything he couldn't control. At the first meeting with the wedding planners, Beatriz ignored him. She spoke with the decorator, the parents, the priest, but avoided looking at him. He, in turn, said nothing. He just watched. His silence was the weapon, and when their eyes finally met, something was sealed. Not a truce, but a warning. There would be no love. No tenderness, only obligations, duty, appearances. That's what he believed. Little did Leonel know that the more he tried to keep the reins, the more his armor would begin to crack, and in that battle of wills, pride would be the first to bleed. Beatriz Montenegro never wanted to be part of a game. She was raised amid the red dust of dirt roads, the open windows that framed an endless horizon, and the wooden barns where she hid forbidden books and dreams far too big to fit within the boundaries of the farm. She was the only daughter of the patriarch Domingos Montenegro, a severe man with heavy hands and words that rang more like commandments than conversation. From childhood, Beatrice knew she carried on her back the weight of a name, a bloodline, and an ancestral curse. That of being a woman in a family where strength was measured in silence and obedience. But unlike generations of Montenegro women who bowed to the will of men, she was born with fire in her eyes. A fire that neither her father, nor tradition, nor time itself had been able to extinguish. While the other girls learned embroidery, Beatriz read poetry in secret. She had memorized the verses of Florbela Espanca, the silenced cries of Carolina Maria de Jesus, and the sorrowful letters of forgotten young women hidden in trunks. She often escaped routine, riding across the fields at dusk with her hair loose and her feet bare. Her mother, who died when she was still a child, left behind only a box of keepsakes and a whisper of advice in a faded letter. Never accept living small. And it was that maternal echo that shaped her soul. Beatrice was not made for obedience. At family gatherings, she defied uncles. At elite parties, she declined invitations, danced with whomever she pleased, and disappeared into the night. Her body bore the wild beauty of women who never apologize. Sun-kissed skin, eyes dark and intense like strong coffee, and a smile that dared anyone to try and tame her. But her greatest weapon was her voice. When she spoke, men fell silent. Not because she shouted, but because she simmered. Her tone belonged to someone who knew what she wanted, even if the path ahead was unclear. And that was unforgivable to the Montenegro clan, who preferred pliable daughters to whole women. The news of her engagement to Leonel Vasconcelos arrived like a sentence. Her father handed her the notice in a thick envelope sealed with wax. Inside, there was no request, only an order. Beatriz felt the ground vanish beneath her. Her hands trembled, but her eyes burned. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She walked to the old oak tree behind the house, where she used to pray in silence. And there, sitting among the roots of the past, she confided in the only force that had never betrayed her, the wind. "They want to silence me, but I will not be quiet," she whispered, more to herself than to the sky. For days, she refused to eat, locked herself in her room and scribbled Leonel's name over and over in an old notebook, as if trying to exorcise a demon with ink. She knew who he was. She knew his type. Arrogant, cold, groomed to be a wolf in a prince's suit, a man who would never understand her soul, an enemy wearing a wedding ring. The idea of binding herself to him tore at every fiber of her being, not out of fear, but out of pride. Being offered as a token of peace between two feuding families was more than humiliating. It was cruel. It was like being thrown into a minefield and told to smile at the enemy. But there was something even more devastating: helplessness. She tried to resist. She sought allies, spoke to the housekeeper, to a rebellious old uncle, even to the town priest. But the answer was always the same. Your duty is to obey. It is your fate. And Beatriz realized that in that world of men shaking hands and sealing pacts over her life, she was seen as a number, a bridge, a pawn. Not a woman with desires, not a soul craving freedom, just the necessary link between power and wealth. Still, Beatriz did not surrender easily. She went to the mirror and cut part of her hair with her own hands, like a ritual of rupture. She wrote a letter to her mother and hid it inside the dress she would wear on the wedding day. And she made herself a promise. If she was to enter that war, she would do it with her head held high, not as a lamb, but as a beast in disguise. She swore she would never give Leonel the pleasure of submission. If he expected a decorative wife, he would find a sharp-edged opponent. And if destiny forced her into the arms of a Vasconcelos, so be it. But they'd better be ready, because inside that woman being forced to marry, there was a storm waiting to be unleashed. She would walk to the altar, wear the white dress, say the words they expected of her. But inside, Beatriz would be all ember, all pride, and one burning question: how far can hatred go when it starts to look like desire? The day of their first meeting was chosen deliberately. A gray, suffocating afternoon, with heavy clouds blanketing the sky like a mourning veil. Everything seemed to announce that this would not simply be a social event, but the prelude to a collision. Beatriz was taken to the Vasconcelos mansion like a prisoner being delivered to the enemy's fortress. The black car that carried her crept down the cobbled road, while she kept her eyes fixed on the horizon, refusing to acknowledge the grand facade growing closer. White columns, glass-paned windows, golden gates, and an icy atmosphere that felt more like a luxurious mausoleum than a home. Leonel waited in the main hall, still, elegant, perfect, his posture rigid, hands in the pockets of his tailored jacket, eyes hidden beneath heavy brows, and an expression of someone about to sign a multi-million-dollar contract, not meet his future bride. When Beatriz entered, a soft whisper passed through the room. The servants bowed their heads. The matriarchs sighed, and time seemed to slow down, as if even the wind wanted to witness the spectacle unfolding. She wore a dark blue dress, plain, without lace or embellishments. Her hair was tied simply, and her makeup nearly non-existent. A silent message: I didn't come here to charm anyone. Leonel, in contrast, wore a perfectly tailored suit, every button in place, shoes polished like mirrors, a living statue carved from vanity and power. The contrast between them was stark, unmistakable. They looked as if they were made from opposite elements. She, of flesh and fire. He, of marble and iron. The first glance was sharp, bare, without flourish, and for 3 full seconds, the world around them disappeared. No more antique paintings, no porcelain vases, no fake smiles from watching relatives. Only one such a 2 souls sizing each other up like predators deciding whether to pounce or flee. Leonel broke the silence first, voice low, deep, with a trace of sarcasm. So it's you, the savior of Montenegro honor. Beatriz raised an eyebrow, crossed her arms, and shot back without hesitation. And you must be the prize my father thinks every woman wants. The air thickened. A few family members choked on their tea, but the 2 of them stood firm. The game had begun. barbs traded like cards at a poker table. Beatriz didn't flinch, and Leonel grew irritated by his failure to intimidate her. The tension rose with every line. "I hope you know how to cook," he said coldly. "And I hope you know how to swallow your pride, because you're going to need to," she replied. The conversation lasted less than 10 minutes, but it left deep marks. With every word, a layer of armor was tested. With every silence, an entire world of unspoken emotion screamed beneath the surface. When they parted, no touch, no kiss, not even a polite smile. The families tried to mask their discomfort, but they knew. They couldn't stand each other. And maybe for that very reason they couldn't stop looking. Leonel ascended the stairs slowly but turned his head once more. Watched Beatriz walk toward the car, her steps firm, her neck held high. And in that moment, without admitting it, he felt a strange chill in his stomach. It wasn't fear. It was recognition. The certainty that she was not a fragile piece in his game. She was a dangerous opponent. And worse, an intriguing one. Beatriz, on her end, stepped into the car with clenched fists, a racing heart, and a confusing sensation somewhere between anger and excitement. Something about him infuriated her deeply, and that made her restless in a way she couldn't name. That meeting didn't seal peace. It sealed the battlefield. There was no love, not yet, but there was something greater than contempt. There was a spark, and a spark, when fed by the right wind, can become a wildfire. The day of the wedding began shrouded in a thick fog, as if even the sky hesitated to witness that forced union. There were no bells, no street celebrations, just a heavy silence hanging over the town, broken here and there by nervous whispers, sidelong glances, and hurried footsteps. People knew they were about to witness something historic, but not because of love. This wasn't a wedding filled with poetry, fragrance, or joy. It was a pact, an alliance between titans. And like every bond forged from fear, pride, and convenience, it carried the omen of a coming storm. The ceremony was set for 10 in the morning in the oldest church in town, the one with peeling walls, cracked stained glass, and wooden pews that groaned with every shift. The altar had been dressed with far too many white flowers, arranged by anxious hands trying to cover the truth. There would be no romance there, only formality. The flickering candles cast dramatic shadows on the walls, as if the ghosts of the Montenegro and Vasconcelos ancestors were watching from the invisible windows of time. Beatriz arrived in a modest car, escorted by her father and 2 uncles. She wore a dress of her own design, plain, without shimmer, without lace, without veil, just pure fabric, like her intent to resist in silence. Her eyes were steady, her hands cold, her heart beating like a war drum. As she stepped out, the first murmurs began, not of admiration, but of astonishment. She didn't smile, she didn't cry, she didn't pretend. She walked like an exiled queen, ready to sit on a throne of thorns. Leonel was already waiting at the altar, impeccable as ever. Dark suit, burgundy tie, hair combed with precision, face unreadable. When he saw her walking down the aisle, his eyes never left her. There was no emotion, but there was a flicker, something between challenge and surrender. He didn't see her as a bride. He saw her as an enemy and accomplice, as someone who, whether she liked it or not, was trapped in the same fate. The priest, visibly uncomfortable, began the ceremony with a trembling voice. He followed the traditional script, but the words echoed hollow and misplaced. In sickness and in health, in love and in hatred. And many swore they heard him choke. The guests, lined up in the pews, kept their hands on their laps, like mourners at a funeral. No one moved. No one smiled. The camera flashes were silent, like muffled gunshots. It was the coldest union those walls had ever seen. When it came time to say, "I do," Beatriz hesitated, just long enough for every eye to turn toward her with unease. But she said it, whispered, barely audible. A yes that sounded more like a dare to the universe. Leonel, in turn, answered firmly, as if signing a declaration of war. And then came the most anticipated and feared moment. The kiss. The symbolic gesture that would seal the union before God and man. But it never came. Leonel turned, as protocol dictated, moved in. But Beatriz subtly turned her face away. And for one eternal second, the altar froze. He paused, his face inches from hers, feeling her steady breath. Then, with deliberate control, he simply took her hand and raised it slightly before the church. No kiss, no touch of lips, Just a visible ring and a silent pact. We're together, but not united. The murmurs began as they exited the church. Guests shocked. Local papers already printing headlines like, "The Kiss That Never Was," "Union or Humiliation," "Marriage Sealed Without Love." The families, embarrassed, tried to disguise their tension. Gustavo Vasconcelos clenched his fists. Domingos Montenegro kept a stony expression. But inside, they all knew. That gesture, or the lack of it, was a public declaration of private war, and no one dared to guess what might come next. At the reception, the atmosphere was even more strained. A hall decorated with flowers and silverware, where smiles were mandatory and conversations came out in half-sentences. Leonel and Beatriz greeted the guests like soldiers on a diplomatic mission. They didn't touch. They didn't look at each other. But they stood side by side, like two blades drawn and waiting for a single slip to strike. And when they finally departed, as night began to fall, they entered the car that would take them to their new home, alone, in silence. The ride passed with no music, no words, not even a sigh. Only the sound of tires on asphalt and thoughts echoing in their heads. Each one lost in their own abyss. But something pulsed in that silence. Something born of tension, contempt, and wounded pride. A primal flame neither could yet name. They didn't love each other. They didn't desire each other. Not yet. But something pulled them toward one another, as if fate was simply waiting for the first spark to set fire to the world they both had sworn to protect. The Vasconcelos mansion was an entity of its own, not just a home, but a symbol of power, tradition, and silence. Its tall walls, once pure white and now stained with shades of gray by time, always seemed to watch. The long hallways carried echoes of ancient footsteps and portraits of ancestors, with hard eyes and stern expressions, lined every corner like immortal judges ready to scrutinize each new inhabitant. It was there, in that mausoleum of marble and dark wood, that Beatriz and Leonel would spend their first days as husband and wife. Not by choice, not by desire, but by protocol. The room assigned to her was on the second floor, separated from Leonel's by a narrow hallway. They would not share a bed, nor a routine, only a roof, and the tension. The first night was marked by silences so thick they could be sliced with a knife. Beatriz unpacked her suitcase slowly, hung her dresses in the wardrobe as if claiming territory, and locked the door. Leonel, in the room next door, loosened his jacket, tossed his shoes forcefully to the floor, and lit a cigar, staring at the ceiling like a man facing an invisible war. Neither of them slept well. The routine began the next day, wrapped in frozen formalities. Breakfast served precisely at 7. Newspaper folded on the table. Servants trained to move in silence. Leonel read while Beatriz stirred her tea with deliberate slowness. A quiet war of resistance. At lunch, meals were accompanied by the sounds of cutlery, fine china, and no conversation. Occasionally, a sharp remark would be thrown, like a blade across the table. "The tea is cold," he'd say. "Matches the room," she'd reply, without lifting her eyes. Leonel kept his habit of leaving early for work and returning late. He spent his days in meetings, managing the family business, but always came home at the same time, carrying the scent of cigarettes and expensive cologne. Beatriz, meanwhile, explored the house with quiet steps, observing every detail like an archaeologist in hostile territory. She discovered locked rooms, objects hidden beneath cloth, old letters tucked into forgotten drawers. She felt like a stranger in a temple built to exalt the Vasconcelos ego. Every corner seemed to whisper, "You do not belong here." But she endured, painted her nails with care, read her forbidden novels in the garden, fed the birds, turned discomfort into a kind of invisible throne, and little by little people began to notice. The servants grew fond of her. Women in town whispered about her strong posture. Even the older staff, long used to Leonel's curt commands, began to lower their voices in her presence. Not out of fear, but out of respect. Leonel noticed, and though he never mentioned it, he felt provoked. Every move she made was an affront to the order he controlled. She didn't beg for attention. She didn't try to please. She didn't bend. And that unsettled him. He began watching her more than he intended. At dinner, he'd steal glances when he thought she wasn't looking. Noticed her loose hair, the way she crossed her legs, the way she bit her lip when reading. One night, he came home early and found her alone in the library, reading a red-covered book. She didn't look up. He lingered in the doorway, pretending to look for something, and only left after hearing her turn the page. Beatriz noticed too. The sound of his footsteps in the hallway, the way his presence filled a room, even in silence. She hated him, or thought she did, but there was something magnetic about that man, a kind of darkness that drew her in and frightened her at once, an abyss she felt tempted to dive into, even knowing she might not come out whole. At night, lying alone in bed, she thought of his restrained gestures, the words he spoke like daggers, the looks they never exchanged, and something else she couldn't yet name. And so life went on in that tense atmosphere, a minefield of emotion. Days turned into weeks, indifference into observation, provocation into habit, and hatred began to give way to something far more dangerous. Curiosity, a force slipping through the cracks of control, threatening to turn that palace of rules into the stage for an uncontrollable blaze. Leonel didn't know when he started waiting for their exchanges. Beatriz didn't realize she smiled when she heard his footsteps. But fate knew. Fate always knew. And it knew that two bodies repelling each other with such intensity are bound sooner or later to collide. And when they do, not even the 100-year-old walls of the Vasconcelos house will be able to contain the impact. The attic of the Vasconcelos mansion was a forgotten territory, stifled by time and fear. No one had gone up there in years. They said it was where old things went to die. Furniture draped in sheets, boxes sealed for decades, moldy suitcases, fogged mirrors, and the scent of old paper mixed with the mildew of things no one wanted to remember. The staircase creaked with each step, and the skylight let in timid beams of light, casting a spectral atmosphere. It was in that place, ignored by all, nearly erased from the house, that Beatriz found the first trace of a buried truth. And that moment wouldn't just change her view of the Vasconcelos. It would rewrite everything she thought she knew about the Montenegro. That afternoon, a storm was forming. Lightning cracked across the sky, and the groaning wood echoed through the mansion like lamentations. Beatriz wandered aimlessly through the halls, trying to escape the emotional claustrophobia tightening around her. She had already explored nearly every room except the attic, the only one still off limits. Not by lock, but by silence. Perhaps for that very reason, she decided to go up. A sudden impulse. A calling. As if something up there had been waiting for her. When she pushed open the door, she choked on the dust of time. But her instinct told her there was more here than just forgotten memories. She began opening boxes one by one, pulling out books, photos, clothes from another era. There were portraits of women with sorrowful eyes, rusted medals, letters in French, manuscripts written in ornate script. But it was a smaller box, hidden beneath a trunk, that caught her attention. It was made of dark wood, with carved details and a golden clasp. When she opened it, she found a stack of yellowed letters tied with a blue satin ribbon, and with them, an old portrait, a young woman with dark hair and eyes uncannily like Beatriz's. She began to read. The letters were signed by a woman named Isabel Montenegro and addressed to House Eduardo Vasconcelos. They were love letters. No, they were more than that. They were confessions, secrets, whispers of a forbidden passion. Isabel wrote of secret meetings, vows exchanged under the hilltop tree, stolen kisses between Sunday masses. But in the final letters, the tone changed. Fear, desperation. Isabel confessed that her father had found out, that she had been locked in the house, that the Vasconcelos were being threatened. And then, the letters stopped. Beatriz froze. The name Isabel Montenegro wasn't unfamiliar. Heart-pounding, she ran downstairs to the mansion's library and began digging through the family records Leonel kept locked away. Records she already knew how to access. She found what she was looking for in a nearly faded family tree. Isabel Montenegro had been the sister of Beatriz's great-grandfather, a young woman who, according to the official family story, had run off with a stranger and was never heard from again. Her blood turned to ice. Isabel hadn't run away. She was silenced, torn from Eduardo by force. The families had discovered the romance, and to preserve pride, honor, and property, they condemned the two to oblivion. Beatriz felt her throat tighten. She and Leonel weren't the first. There had already been love between a Montenegro and a Vasconcelos. A love as intense as it was dangerous. A love that had been smothered by the same hands now trying to shape her destiny. When Leonel arrived that night, he found Beatriz seated at the table, the letters spread before her. He frowned but said nothing. sat across from her, hands clasped. She didn't look at him. She simply slid the first letter toward him and said, "Read. Then tell me if you still think we're just a forced alliance." Leonel read. At first, with skepticism. But gradually, the words sank in. The name Isabel echoed inside him like a half-told childhood memory. He remembered an old painting that had disappeared. Conversations cut short when he entered the room. A diary his grandmother kept hidden. When he finished the last letter, he looked up at Beatriz. And for the first time, their eyes weren't weapons. They were mirrors. "They tried to erase this," he murmured. "But they failed," she replied. "Because it's here, inside us." In that moment, something shifted. It wasn't love, not yet, but it was recognition, a shared grief, an inherited pain that bound them in a way deeper than marriage. They didn't know what to do next, whether they should drift further apart or come closer. But they knew that from that moment on, they were connected by something much stronger than ceremony. The past, so carefully buried by their families, was now knocking at the door, and it demanded vengeance, or resurrection. The house was asleep. The hallways lay cloaked in long shadows, and the candles that once flickered on the walls like ghosts from the past were now just remnants of spent wax. Rain tapped softly against the windows, and the wind slipping through the cracks of the mansion played like a forgotten melody, one heard only by those who still remembered how to listen. It was midnight, a nameless hour, when anything feels possible, even what was never spoken. And it was in this liminal space, between the sleep of the living and the lament of the dead, that Beatriz descended the stairs slowly, guided by a restlessness she couldn't name, an impulse, a calling, a silent urgency. She wore a long nightgown of fine fabric, draped in a wool shawl. Her bare feet touched the cold floor cautiously, as if afraid to wake the secrets of the house. Her steps led her to the old ballroom, the one kept shut during the day, but which, that night, seemed to breathe on its own. The doors stood ajar. Inside, the black grand piano gleamed under the pale moonlight streaming through the high windows. The music came from there, soft, painful, and unexpected. Beatriz moved closer, her heart pounding, and stopped. Leonel was at the piano. He wore only a white shirt, collar unbuttoned, sleeves rolled up, face lowered over the keys. His fingers danced with precision over the ivory, as if each note was a memory torn from him. He hadn't noticed her yet. He played like someone confessing, like someone bleeding. And in that moment, Beatriz saw him as never before. Not the arrogant heir, but a broken man trying to hold up the empire that suffocated him. She approached, not knowing why. She simply let herself move. When Leonel noticed, he stopped. His hands hovered above the keys, as if the notes still hung in the air between them. He looked at her with a mixture of surprise and calm, and for the first time, there was no irony in his eyes. There was vulnerability. "I didn't know you played," Beatriz whispered. "Almost no one does," he replied, softly, intimately. "It's the only thing I never managed to turn into an obligation." The silence between them was heavy, but not uncomfortable. It was thick, meaningful. She looked around and saw that the ballroom had once hosted dances. The unlit chandeliers, the heavy curtains, the polished floor. Everything seemed to be waiting for a reunion. Then, without knowing why she did it, or perhaps knowing exactly, Beatriz reached out her hand to him. "Teach me?" Leonel hesitated. That broke all the unspoken rules they had carefully built. But something in her eyes also begged for escape, for connection, for a crack in the wall. He rose slowly and took her hand. It was cold, small inside his, and together they stepped to the center of the room, where silence felt sacred. There was no music now, but there was rhythm. He led her with confidence, unhurried, their steps slow, bodies close, breaths crossing. Beatriz felt the heat of his skin, the subtle scent of wood and cologne, the slight tremor in his fingers. Leonel, in turn, noticed every detail. The shiver up her arm, the way her eyes stayed locked on his, unafraid, unmasked. The dance was imperfect, hesitant, but honest, and in one nearly accidental spin, their bodies came too close. She stumbled. He caught her. Hands met at the waist. Their faces were inches apart. And then, the world stopped. Beatriz's gaze sank into his like a dive with no return. There was as much contempt as desire in that look, as much pride as surrender. And when she took a deep breath, she felt something she'd never known before. Longing, not to win, resist, or defy, but to yield. Just for a second. Leonel leaned in closer. Their lips nearly brushed. Her heart pounded so loudly she was sure he could hear it. But at the last second, she turned her face away. "Not yet," she whispered. He didn't push. Released her waist gently, stepped back, and only nodded. "I'll wait." She walked to the door without looking back. But as she climbed the stairs, her body was on fire. And she knew, with every certainty she had always clung to, that that touch had changed everything. The impossible now tasted like reality, and hate had taken on its most dangerous form, contained desire. All true passion, when left unspoken, becomes fertile ground for jealousy, and jealousy, in turn, is a subtle poison that starts as a whisper and ends as a scream. The bond between Beatriz and Leonel, built on silence, avoided touches, and glances heavy with tension, had yet to find a name. But fate, ruthless as ever, decided to test the limits of this feeling. And it did so in the cruelest way, by casting into the story the shadows of the past and the desires of others. That fragile peace forged in the mansion's midnight hours would soon be shattered by two unexpected presences, one from the present, and one Leonel would rather forget. The new suitor arrived as if by chance, but with the precision of someone who had planned everything. Daniel Alencar, a young lawyer with a sweet voice, a charming smile, and carefully veiled intentions. He came from a respected family and had courted Beatriz before the arranged marriage, though he had never managed more than a few wine-soaked polite conversations at parties. Now, taking advantage of the whispers surrounding the cold marriage between her and Leonel, Daniel returned to town with new projects and old intentions. His first appearance came during a municipal inauguration. Beatriz was there as a representative of the Montenegro Vasconcelos family, wearing a sober yet elegant dress and a serenity forged through silent war. Daniel saw her from afar and wasted no time. He approached with familiarity, kissed her hand, and smiled like someone who still held hope. "Beatriz, more beautiful than I ever remember." "Daniel," she replied, polite but alert. "I heard you're married now." "I am." "Happy?" he asked, lowering his voice. Beatriz inhaled deeply. "Busy." Leonel, who had been talking to Councilman just a few steps away, saw it all, and he didn't like it. His posture changed, his eyes narrowed, his jaw tightened. He knew Daniel, and he could recognize a hunter in motion. That night, the silence between him and Beatriz at dinner was heavier than usual. He wanted to ask, wanted to say how much he hated the way that lawyer looked at her, but he couldn't, because he still didn't know what she meant to him, because he still pretended not to feel. But fate wasn't finished. That's when she came back. Cynthia Vasconcelos, Leonel's ex-daughter of a distant cousin, raised as a socialite, living in São Paulo since the end of their relationship. Tall, blonde, feline eyes, and a razor-sharp personality. The kind of woman who knew exactly the power she wielded and used it like a blade. She and Leonel had a long, on-again, off-again relationship that ended when he, exhausted from the games, decided to follow the family path. But Cynthia never truly accepted the end. And now, upon hearing of his marriage, she returned, uninvited, like lightning from a clear sky. She arrived at the mansion over a weekend, claiming to be visiting the uncles. The family, of course, welcomed her with open arms. Beatriz watched from afar, a strange knot forming in her chest. It wasn't exactly jealousy, it was more instinctual, like the sharp awareness that a predator had entered her territory. Cynthia walked through the house as if it were still hers. She hugged Leonel with too much familiarity, laughed loudly, touched his arm often, and made a point to ignore Beatriz with every gesture. On the first night, during an improvised dinner on the veranda, Cynthia couldn't resist. "You two are so discreet," she said, staring at Beatriz with a cynical smile. "And you're just as inappropriate as ever," Beatriz replied, without raising her voice. Leonel coughed, barely hiding a laugh. But inside, the discomfort was growing. Cynthia sensed the tension and decided to push further. One rainy afternoon, she barged into the library where Leonel was reading alone, sat beside him, crossed her legs, and began recalling old times. Kisses stolen in the beach house garden, the trips, the plans that never materialized. She touched his hand, tried to kiss him. That's when he pulled away. "That's in the past, Cynthia. Do you love her?" she asked, wounded. Leonel hesitated. "I don't know yet, but I do know. With you, I feel nothing now." Cynthia left the mansion the next day without saying goodbye, and Beatrice, watching her go, knew, not by words, but by the look in Leonel's eyes that night. He watched her with something new. Not anger, not disdain, but care. The days that followed were filled with quieter silences. Beatrice and Leonel didn't speak of Cynthia or Daniel, but both knew. What they felt for each other could no longer be denied. The danger now was different, resisting a passion that grew precisely where hatred was supposed to live. And when enemies begin to protect one another, the world, inevitably, begins to collapse. One night, the town fell into one of those silences so deep that even the crickets seemed to be in mourning. The full moon cast a silver glow across the rooftops, and the Vasconcelos mansion, as imposing as ever, stood tall like a monument to pride. But inside, within its heavy halls and oppressive corridors, something was about to collapse. Not a wall, not a door, but a heart. The days following Cynthia's departure and Daniel's withdrawal were marked by a discomforting calm. Beatriz and Leonel moved through the house like two planets in orbit, aware of the other's presence, drawn to one another, yet still refusing to collide. There was a restrained glow in his eyes, and in hers, a constant challenge. Their conversations grew more frequent, but remained sharp. Their touch was still avoided, yet their eyes whispered everything their lips feared to say. It was as if something kept pushing them together, and something greater still tried to hold them apart. That night, Beatrice couldn't sleep. She wore a light robe, her hair loose, and her bare feet once again carried her to the main hall. She needed air, space, silence. But as she pushed the doors open, she came face to face with Leonel, there again, as if fate enjoyed placing them in the same setting over and over, until they surrendered to the script. He wore a gray shirt, unbuttoned at the chest, and held a glass of wine. His back was turned, but her presence made him slowly turn around. Their eyes met, and for a moment, time froze. Neither spoke. They simply stared at each other like two souls about to cross a line with no return. "You always show up when I'm trying to forget you exist," he said, his voice low, caught between anger and desire. Beatrice stepped closer. "And you always show up when I think I can finally hate you in peace." Leonel took a step. She didn't back away. "You hate me then?" he asked, a tense smile on his lips. "With everything I've got," she replied, unblinking. "Because you represent everything I swore I'd destroy." "And yet," he began, but didn't finish. His gaze dropped to her lips. "And yet you're here." The air grew heavy. Her heart pounded like a war drum in her chest. Her skin trembled, but her voice stayed steady. "I'm here because I no longer know where the hatred ends and what begins," he whispered, stepping closer. And then, she said it, all at once, like tearing out a thorn buried in her soul. "Because I love you." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the wind dared not blow. Beatrice felt her body freeze. She wanted to retreat, to hide, to take it back, but it was too late. The truth was there, naked and irreversible. Leonel stared at her, stunned, as if he had never heard words so violent, because this love wasn't sweet or romantic or planned. It was born from confrontation, tension, forced closeness, curiosity turned addiction. It was a love that broke him, and that terrified him. "I hate you," he murmured. Beatrice felt her chest tighten. "I know," she answered, tears beginning to form. "I hate you," he repeated, "because I love you, and I never planned this. I never wanted to feel this for you." And then they kissed. It wasn't gentle. It was intense, urgent, clumsy, real. A kiss that carried all the anger, the desire, the pain, and the affection built up over weeks. A kiss that shattered silence, burned rules, and silenced pride. His hands held her face like he was afraid she'd run. Her fingers clutched his shirt like she was afraid to fall. And there, between two enemies, a love was born that asked for no permission. It simply exploded. When they finally pulled apart, breathless, Beatrice pressed her forehead to his. "This changes everything." "No," he said with a tired smile. "This reveals everything." From that night on, nothing would be the same. Because now, love existed. And with it came the certainty that everything they had built to keep each other away was starting to crumble. The town, small like all those that pretend to be discreet, didn't need much to turn a whisper into a storm. All it took was one maid speaking out of turn, a neighbor seeing more than they should, and a single glance exchanged in public between Beatrice and Leonel for what should have been a precious secret. That confession whispered at midnight, sealed with the most anticipated kiss in the history of two rival families, to become a scandal. A scandal that didn't stay confined to the mansion's walls, but spread like wildfire, igniting bar chatter, sewing tables, confessionals, and even Sunday sermons. She's truly in love. He gave in to the charms of a Montenegro. They're sleeping together, and they say she runs the house more than he does. This is witchcraft. Must be the work of a rebellious woman. The town's elite, so used to pretending at morality while dealing filth behind closed doors, reacted with shock and hypocrisy. But the two families responded with something even more violent: shame. What was supposed to be a cold agreement, a symbolic union, a political truce, was now turning into an emotional soap opera. And emotions were dangerous. Domingos Montenegro and Gustavo Vasconcelos wasted no time. For the first time in years, they agreed on something. This had to end. Leonel found out about the patriarch's meeting through a terse phone call from his father. "You've stained the Vasconcelos name." "No, I just allowed myself to feel. Feeling is for the weak." Beatriz, meanwhile, was ambushed by Aunt Odette, who stormed into the mansion with wide eyes and a crucifix clutched in hand. "They're saying you knelt before him, that you gave up your dignity." "I did kneel, but it was to free a heart you've spent generations trying to chain." The tension between the couple grew as fast as the rumors. They knew the world around them was about to explode, but they couldn't stay away from each other. Each meeting was more intense, every touch more dangerous, each kiss more forbidden. And in the middle of this emotional chaos, Beatrice made a decision that would change everything. One night, Leonel came home and didn't find her. The room was empty, the closet open, a suitcase gone, and on the bed, a handwritten note in firm, aching script. "Leonel, I love you, but I can't keep fighting the whole world, nor live hidden among your silences and my wounds. If one day love is enough, come find me. If not, forget me. Beatrice." He read it again and again until the words stopped making sense. He threw the wine glass at the wall, cursed, yelled, but he didn't cry. Not yet. Because he didn't know how to cry for something that still hurt like a fresh blade. The next day, the local newspapers screamed with scandalous headlines. Beatriz Montenegro abandons marriage and flees. Leonel Vasconcelos publicly humiliated by his own wife. The new generation repeats the sins of the cursed lovers of the past. The entire town became a courtroom, and they, the defendants. But unlike the generations before them, now there was something the rumors couldn't erase. The truth of what they had felt. And that truth, though wounded, was still breathing. Beatrice went to a neighboring town, taking refuge in the home of a former teacher, where she could finally breathe far from the chains of both surnames. She spent her days writing, walking, trying to sew together a new version of herself, a whole woman, outside the war-torn frame of her family's legacy. But every night, before sleep, she looked out the window and wondered if Leonel was out there, about to appear. As for Leonel, he drowned in silence, stopped playing piano, ignored his business, avoided the staff, and every night he walked to the veranda where they had danced for the first time, staring into the void, waiting for something, or someone, who might never return. The separation became official weeks later, but in their hearts, official meant nothing, because it was no longer the marriage that bound them. It was love, and love, even absent, even wounded, still pulsed. When Beatrice chose to leave, it wasn't with the impulse of someone running out of weakness, but with the silent courage of someone choosing to survive. The small suitcase, almost symbolic, carried less clothing and more decisions. She took only the essentials: a few simple dresses, the notebooks where she wrote her pain disguised as poetry, and an old photograph of her mother, the one she always kept hidden between the pages of books. She left at dawn, before the servants woke, before the house could remind her of every stifled glance, every touch avoided, every love interrupted by surnames that were never truly hers. Beatrice wasn't running from Leonel. She was fleeing the world that forbade them. She took refuge in a small nearby town, quiet and anonymous, with narrow streets and low houses, where the past didn't yet dare to call her by name. She was welcomed by Marilia, a former teacher who once taught her that being a woman wasn't about obeying. It was about resisting. There, among cups of tea and lazy afternoons on the porch, Beatrice rediscovered silence, but not the kind that imprisons, the kind that heals. She sewed for the neighborhood ladies, wrote letters she never sent, and every night, before closing her eyes, she whispered the phrase she feared most: maybe he won't come. Meanwhile, Leonel was falling apart. Contrary to everyone's expectations, even his own, he didn't become colder, or more arrogant, or more ruthless. He became hollow. Without Beatriz, the mansion felt like a mausoleum. The piano was silent. The servants tiptoed. His business began to suffer. Forgotten meetings, mistakes, delays. Gustavo Vasconcelos tried to shake him, to threaten him, to remind him of his duty. But Leonel no longer listened. He could only think of her. How she smiled while secretly reading in the library. How she bit her lip when challenging him. How she had said, "I love you," like someone tossing a grenade and waiting for the explosion with eyes wide open. He read her note so many times the ink began to fade. Spent sleepless nights trying to find a way to reach her without seeming weak. But there was no more room for pride. The man Beatriz had touched was no longer the heir shaped to win political battles. He was a man who was willing to lose the whole world if it meant winning her back. And so, on a cloudy morning, he made a decision. He threw on a wrinkled white shirt, got in the car, and left without telling anyone. He carried only a letter in his pocket, written by his own hand, with the awkward handwriting of someone who had never allowed himself to write his feelings. He drove for hours, down dusty roads, past dry fields, and towns he never imagined visiting. And when he arrived, he parked in front of a modest house, flowers blooming on the windowsill, and stood there, staring at the door, like a man afraid of opening not just a house, but his own soul. Inside, Beatriz felt his presence before she saw him. Her heart raced like it had the first time. When she opened the door, there he was, tired, disheveled, dark circles under his eyes, but with something new on his face. Vulnerability. "I came," he began, but his voice cracked. "Why?" she asked, unmoving. He pulled the note she had left on the bed from his pocket and held it out. "Because I can't forget you. Because I learned that love isn't enough. But even so, it's everything." She read more in his eyes than in the letter. She saw he had broken. Saw that the man once trained to dominate was now only asking to be accepted. And there, at the humble doorstep of a house without gold, without crests, without conventions, two hearts looked at each other without armor. "I don't know if I can go back to all of that," she confessed. "Neither do I, but I don't want to go back without you." The embrace was long, trembling, like holding someone who might vanish at any moment. There were no promises, no plans, just the simplest and hardest decision of all, to start again. Far from the eyes, the legacies, the inherited wars. For the first time, not as Vasconcelos and Montenegro, but as Leonel and Beatriz. There are pacts sealed with cold signatures, golden seals, and silent witnesses. But there are others that need no paper, no public vow, because they are forged in the depths of two hearts that decided, together, to stop running from themselves. The reunion of Beatriz and Leonel was not just a return, it was a reinvention, a meticulous dismantling of everything they had been taught to be, so they could finally discover who they truly were. Not heirs, not enemies, not pawns in a cruel game, but chosen two survivors of a love that insisted on being born where only ruins were expected. In the weeks following her escape, they lived almost like ghosts of their former selves. They didn't return to the city immediately. They chose to remain in that hidden village where no one called them by their surnames, where they weren't seen as alliances or scandals, but simply as a couple. Those were days of rediscovery. Leonel, far from spreadsheets, suits, and absolute control, learned how to sleep in, to prepare coffee the way she liked, to laugh at simple things. And Beatriz, for the first time in many years, felt what it was like to be loved without being shaped, to be desired not out of duty, but by choice. They walked hand in hand down dirt roads, sat in the town square to hear children sing, slept wrapped in each other's arms like those who feared the world, but trusted the other's chest as their final fortress. And on one of those afternoons, under a sky filled with cotton clouds, they decided to make a new pact. They sat face to face at a simple wooden table, with no witnesses, no rings, no ceremony. "Last time, we were forced," Beatriz said. "We entered a marriage that wasn't ours." "I know," Leonel replied, holding her hands. "And even so, we built something inside that prison. But now I want a different kind of agreement." "A pact?" He smiled. "A pact of freedom," she said. "One where you're free to love me, and I'm free to stay." Leonel nodded, moved. He had never been good at saying, "I love you," but in that moment, he understood that to love also meant to accept the other's freedom. "I promise not to cage you," he whispered, "but I'll never let you walk away without a fight again." And so, with that simple gesture, they forged a new kind of bond. Not based on surnames, inheritance, or strategy, but on the pure truth of two hearts that learned to recognize each other amid the ruins of their past. It was a silent promise of respect, of presence, of partnership. Beatriz didn't ask him to abandon his world. She only asked that he never let it devour her again. Leonel didn't ask her to become who she used to be, only that she let him become better, for her. They decided never to return to the mansion. They bought a modest house on top of a hill, where the city could be seen from afar, far enough not to suffocate them, close enough to slowly rebuild the bridges with what they had left behind. They received visitors cautiously. Some relatives still avoided them. Others, curious, began to approach. But the most important thing was that, for the first time, they were in control of their own story. And perhaps the greatest symbol of this new chapter was the bedroom. A space with wide windows, light curtains, a shelf full of Beatriz's books, and an old piano Leonel had restored in silence. In that room, they played together for the first time, a melody without a name, but full of meaning. There were no more Montenegro, no more Vasconcelos. There were only two lovers, survivors of an absurd war, wearing their scars as invisible rings. The world still looked at them with suspicion, but for the first time, they looked at themselves with peace. And that was enough, because the pact was sealed, not with promises of forever, but with the vow to begin again each day, side by side, for love. Time, when not used as punishment, becomes a balm. And that's exactly what happened with Beatriz and Leonel. Years passed since the day they sealed their pact of freedom, and as the seasons changed, the pain of the past began to fade, like an old photograph slowly losing its color. The town, once a stage for scandal, began to accept them, not out of kindness, but because their love endured time, and what endures time imposes itself, quietly, with dignity. They stopped being the couple who shocked their families and became a living symbol of transformation. But the true mark of that change wouldn't come from words or silence. It would come pampamoine from a fragile cry in the middle of a summer night. Beatriz gave birth at home. She refused luxurious hospitals, parties, or social frills. She wanted to feel the pain in its fullness. She wanted to bring into the world, with her own body, a life that would finally seal the union of two worlds that once hated each other, as if blood had color. The birth was intense. Leonel stayed by her side the entire time, holding her hands, whispering words that only she could hear. When the baby's cry echoed through the house, no wall could bear the weight of that emotion. Beatriz cried like never before. So did Leonel. They named the boy Juan Isabel Vasconcelos Montenegro. Juan, for its biblical meaning of renewal. Isabel, in honor of the silenced ancestor whose story they unearthed and rewrote. And both surnames together, as witnesses to a new cycle. Not for tradition, but by choice. For the first time, a Montenegro and a Vasconcelos were not on opposite sides of a conflict. They were united in skin, in blood, in future. The boy grew up among books and gardens. He wasn't raised with the burden of being an heir or the weight of a name. He learned to plant with his mother and play piano with his father. Leonel taught him strength, but also encouraged him to cry when needed. Beatriz taught him freedom, but also the responsibility of being a bridge in a world that still insisted on building walls. Juan carried in his eyes the peace of someone born after the war, and in his smile, the hope that love can indeed break centuries-old cycles. The families slowly began to draw near. His baptism was the first event in decades where Montenegros and Vasconcelos sat side by side without suspicion. It wasn't easy, but the boy, in Beatriz's arms, was impossible to hate. He was too symbolic, too beautiful, too innocent. No one could fight a baby whose name alone marked the end of a century-old war. One day when Juan turned 5, Beatriz and Leonel took him to the attic of the old mansion, now restored as a public library. They showed him Isabel and Eduardo's letters. They told him the true story, and with tears in their eyes they said, "You were not born to repeat the pain. You were born to heal what couldn't be healed before you." Juan didn't understand everything, but he hugged them tightly. And in that embrace, Beatriz felt something surge through her like a current of pure love. She had won. Not as women who win wars with weapons, but as those who face entire generations just by existing. Leonel, in turn, looked at his son and understood that none of it was luck. It was choice. The consequence of every brave gesture, every renunciation, every sleepless night. It was the result of the day he allowed himself to love the woman who taught him, day after day, that love is not a prison. It is liberation. And so, this story ends, not in tragedy nor in glory, but in continuity, in the birth of a new name, a new chance, a new time. Because sometimes, true love does not reveal itself in the first kiss, nor in the burning passion. Sometimes, it reveals itself in the child who carries two names and no war.